and welcome to another episode of Common Sense with Dr. Ben Carson. I'm your host, Ben Carson. And, I talk about it all the time. Common sense, not very common anymore. But we have a guest today who has a lot of common sense. Our special guest is Spencer Klavan. He's a scholar, a writer, a podcaster, earned a doctorate in ancient Greek literature from Oxford University, an editor at the Claremont Institute, and author of a new book, To Save the Wst, Ancient Wisdom for 5 Modern Crises. Welcome, Spencer, and thank you for joining our podcast today.
Thank you, Dr. Carson. It's really wonderful to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, How to Save the Wst. Now, that's a pretty ambitious title.
Yeah.
Western ideals have sort of become a touchstone in today's cultural wars, and it's come to mean racism and bigotry. Why is that wrong, and why does the West need saving?
Yeah. Well, it's funny, not everybody would describe a person that studies ancient Greek philosophy as somebody with a lot of common sense. In fact, sometimes those two things are kind of considered opposites. And I think that speaks to a widespread cultural assumption we have. We may not recognize it, but we've been kind of taught through our media outlets and our entertainment that the wisdom of the past, seeking wisdom in the great traditions of Athens and Jerusalem, that this is somehow a kind of backwards or a superstitious way of going about things. Because those people in the past, they were worse than us. They were nasty, racist, misogynist, exclusive. You throw any label at it, and people say these sorts of things, And one thing that I was very lucky about is that when I was very young, I grew up in a house filled with books. And one thing I realized, first of all, I didn't know that was weird. I thought that everybody did, and I had to learn that was a lucky thing. But what I learned very quickly is that being surrounded by books means being surrounded by friends. And when we talk about the West, what we're really talking about is a great conversation that has endured for thousands of years. People from, the great civilizations of Greece and Rome. That's what we mean when we talk about Athens, classical antiquity. And then the wisdom literature, the revelation, the scripture of Judaism and Christianity. And that's what we mean when we talk about Jerusalem. And so when you pass these things down through centuries, it can feel as if this is some sort of obscure, antiquarian kind of backwards interest. But really, it's incredibly urgent. I mean, when we wake up in the news every day, we see crisis after crisis. It feels like everything is totally unprecedented. But what I'm arguing in this book is that really, the questions we're up against aren't unprecedented. They're questions like, what is a human being? And, what's our place in the universe? And for those questions, the great tradition is the best place to seek sane answers. These things aren't just dusty books. They're not, backward superstitions. They're a community. It means we're not alone. And we don't have to face the future just on our own meager resources. So I wanted to give people access to that tradition and those riches, because I think we're going to need them as the future comes rattling ahead.
Well, Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, said there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
we rehashing the same things. And if we could learn from what's happened in the past, rather than just rewriting it or discarding it, I think maybe we could make some real progress.
Oh,
but
absolutely.
It seems to be antithetical to our nature to do that. But what, in fact, are these 5 crises? Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. We hear the word crisis all the time. It's one of the most, I think, maybe overused word in the news. You get the crisis of the supply chain, the COVID crisis, economic crises. And, don't get me wrong, these are all bad things. They're things to be concerned about. A lot of them are very serious. But the word crisis is a Greek word, and I'm using it in a very specific way here. It comes from this Greek idea, krino, which means I judge or I make a decision. And so a crisis in the true sense is an opposition, a choosing point, a time for choosing between two fundamentally irreconcilable ways of looking at the world. Is there absolute truth, or is everything relative? That's a crisis if you have to decide between those two options. And so each of these crises that I talk about in the book, I've tried to take the things that we think about in the news, things that you might see every day, and say, what are the crises that are underlying this problem, these sets of problems? What are the big questions that we're asking? Because if we can get there, then we can maybe start to think about ways to answer the underlying questions. So the first crisis is the one I just alluded to, the crisis of reality. Right. Is there such a thing as true or false, or is there nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so? A very ancient question in philosophy, and there are a lot of good reasons, arguments that I present in the book to thinking that we either have to believe in truth or we should just give up altogether because it's all just about power. So if we believe in truth, then we kind of get led on to this next question, which is the crisis of the body. If truth is out there, and if truth is eternal and it endures forever, why do we have to live in this world of death and decay that we suffer so terribly in our bodies? And I think you see people grappling with this very ancient question all over the place. The sudden uptick that we're having in gender dysphoria, this extreme discomfort and ideological even discomfort with the body. So I'm arguing in this section that...
And the transhumanists who
yes.
think that maybe we can just shed these bodies and
yes.
that'll solve a lot of our problems.
Well, that's that's a great example of something that, maybe if you saw this in the news cycle, you wouldn't always draw this connection, but the transgender phenomenon, the transhuman phenomenon are part of the same thing. They're part of this loathing that we are feeling about just living in our humanity. And so this part of the book is about what our humanity offers that is good and worthwhile. And I present this Greek idea called hylomorphism, which is the idea that we are souls in bodies, that our souls and our bodies are kind of inextricably connected from one another, and our bodies are the language of the soul. And when you start talking this way, this leads you into these other big questions that I think are really almost behind everything that we're fighting over. That's the crisis of meaning and the crisis of religion. They're kind of bound up together. Right. Can we believe in anything beyond the here and now? Because if we can't, then everything is basically just sort of a machine that we just kind of fight over these different material things, but we never really have any purpose to our lives. And so those are in the crisis of meaning and religion section, I'm talking about how the tradition can help us to find what's beyond mere materialism. And then in that crisis of regime, the last section, I say, well, these are all nice things to talk about. They obviously matter very much, but what are we going to do? This is what's going to happen to America. And what is America supposed to be? How does America fit into the West? And I'm arguing that America is really the pinnacle of what the West has achieved politically, even now, even still. And so there are some ways that we can invest again in that American idea as part of the project of saving the West.
And that's the reason that we have these big, sophisticated brains. Unlike animals who have big, sophisticated midbrains so they can react to stuff, we have these big frontal lobes so that we can engage in rational thought processing, extract information from the past, integrate it with information from the present, project it into the future, do very complex analyses. And you've obviously done a lot of that, and we appreciate it. And we all want to benefit from that itself. But what do the great thinkers say about male and female gender roles? I'm sure we're not the first ones to grapple with this.
No, we are certainly not. We might be the first to go through such a widespread civilization level confusion about how this works. But, as has been pointed out, there's basically always been an acknowledgement that there are men and women. This is one of the most obvious majority views throughout all of history. But one thing that I think can get lost when we start to have these arguments over transgenderism and born in the wrong body and all of that stuff is that, we're not actually just our bodies, and we're not just a kind of disembodied spark of, pure consciousness, or gender identity is kind of the modern term for this,
Right.
disembodied spark that can reform the body at will. One thing you learn from studying the ancients is that those options have been on the table for a very long time. Those aren't new. There were, for instance, among the Neoplatonists, there were people that suggested that really we need to get out of, transcend the flesh and reconnect with some kind of, immaterial divine all. The thing that we discover when we dig a little deeper into these traditions is that never really quite works. We always end up thinking it's going to set us free if we can get rid of our, just these, the one modern term I've heard is, our ape-brained meat sacks, this very grotesque way of talking about the body that you hear a lot online now. But if you read, for instance, the book of Genesis, right, there's an amazing moment in which God breathes life into the dust. And what's really interesting to me about that is the dust is not a human being, but the breath of life isn't a human being either. The human beings aren't just these kind of airy idea floating things. It's when the breath of life enters into the dust that it becomes a living soul, a nefesh chaim in the Hebrew. And this is wonderfully and remarkably identical to this Greek idea that I mentioned earlier of hylomorphism. In Greek, hule is matter, it's stuff, it's things like the size of our brains, for instance, which has a kind of material component. But then it's not just that those brains have certain, machinery in them. It's also, as you well know, it's that they make us able to see form, shape, and order in the world. And this is the Greek word morphe, the shape that things take. Mm-hmm. And so hylomorphism is basically the Greek way of saying that same idea that's in Genesis, that mankind is made from a fusion of matter and spirit. And our bodies are not a mistake, but our souls aren't an illusion either. Our bodies are the language in which the soul is expressed. And if that's true, then this idea that you're born into the wrong body, or that your body should be reconfigured to match some true essential you, you can see why that's not going to work in advance, and you can offer to yourself and to others a saner way of understanding what you are. You're not just a kind of lump of stuff to be played around with. You're actually an embodied soul, which is a precious thing to be. There's only a countable number of them in the universe. And this is something I think that we could definitely recover on this topic.
And if in fact, we don't have bodies, then we don't have a mechanism to reproduce ourselves.
Yes.
We become extinct pretty quickly.
Right. I think the transhumanists would say, well, that's okay because we'll just live in our robot bodies. But my feeling is, well, who will that be? That won't be you. That'll be a kind of computer code, essentially.
Well, why do you think conservative thought is losing the culture war?
I think there are a number of reasons, and most of them have to do with the heart. And the left is very good at appealing to the heart, and we, I think, as conservatives, scorn and mock them for that a lot of the time. It's the libs, and they have their tears and their snowflakes, and they tug at the heartstrings.
But
and I think what's that?
It works.
Exactly. Well, it's right. It's half true, right? It's half true because appeals to emotion that have no logic behind them are kind of contemptible, and they do make us think like that's very childish. But there's a reason why they work, and that's because we're not just brains in jars. We have a whole inner life that we connect to each other and to the world with. And so this is why, the core section of the book, the Crisis of Meaning section, is about art. It's about what art does and how it communicates to us. And you say, well, why has the left spent so much time and energy capturing Hollywood? We just watched the Oscars last night, and everybody was talking about equity and these big, leftist political buzzwords. It's like, why has a political movement spent so much time capturing our major artistic institutions? And it's because they know that human beings, in order to understand things, need to be taught in more than one way. You can't just tell people things, you also have to show them. And this is kind of what art does. I think that conservatives, sometimes we just reject the culture because there's a lot that's messy and ugly in it. But slowly now, I think we're learning that we can't do that. We actually, although we have good arguments and although we are rationally, I think, on the right side of these debates, we also need to be making stories about why those arguments are not just factually true, but ennobling, virtuous, good, heroic. I mean, these words, I think, are the kind of things that people need to connect to what we're saying, because the leftist project is breaking down and failing them everywhere. They're miserable in these, kind of anti-human forms of life, but we need to offer them something better.
Life imitates art, and we've got to get the right art out there, huh?
I think so. I mean, art, the ancients had this saying. Cicero talks about the way rhetoric works, and rhetoric, of course, is very close to art. And he says it can movere, it can move us, it can docere, it can teach us, and it can delectare, it can delight us. And it does all those three things at once by, as you sort of indicated, representing the world to us, showing us the world in a certain way. And when somebody gets up and, performs a play, they're telling you this is how the world is. And the left does that all the time. They say the world is like this, men and women are like this. And that's why they're constantly, shoving these images at us of how men can become women and, the sex is, indiscriminate sex is good. And, we have got, I think, to put our own images out there, our own stories. I mean, this is one reason why I love what the Daily Wire is doing and other places like that they're making narrative accounts, visions of what the future could look like if we took a better path.
Exactly. Well, as you can see, we have a very fascinating guest today, Spencer Klavan, and we'll be right back in 1 minute with more. And we're back with Spencer Klavan. I guess you could call him a philosopher. He certainly, I think, qualifies.
I'd be honored to be called a philosopher, sure.
But I want to ask you about the crisis in religion. We seem to be moving away from faith in our society. And it worked pretty well for us for a long time. It helped us to go from a ragtag bunch of militiamen to the pinnacle of the world in record time. What's happened to us in that regard?
Well, there's a line in the Bible, I'm sure you're familiar with it. The fool hath said in his heart, there is no God. Yeah. And it's from the Psalms. And I think, I don't know about you, I used to read that line and I just thought, oh, that means that like atheists are dumb, basically. That this means it's stupid to be an atheist. And fair enough, but I actually think there's something much more profound going on in that passage. I think that what the Bible says again and again is that if you tell yourself you don't have a God, if you believe that there's no higher power that you worship, then you're kidding yourself. You're turning yourself into a fool. It's kind of an act of self-deception, because to talk about philosophy for a second and hopefully to do philosophy in a commonsensical kind of way, you get up in the morning and you get out of bed. Well, why? Because you want something. You want coffee, you have to go to work, whatever. If you keep asking that why question long enough, you'll find that everybody has something that they say, well, that's because this is just good. Even if they don't want to go to work, they go because they want money. Why do they want money? Because they want to be able to do whatever they want. And ultimately, somebody is going to give you a final cause, a goal, or a highest purpose that's driving their life, even if they don't know it. Everybody has this. And this is a kind of worship. When you bend the knee to something, when you put it above all other things, when you do what it tells you to do, that's worshiping. And so we're all worshiping all the time. Everybody is a worshiping being. Humanity, mankind, is a worshiping species. And so basically what I think happened is we fell victim to a kind of blindness that said we weren't doing religion, that we could get by with just kind of material things, and that we could, science basically had replaced all of this, and we would just be prosperous and rich, and that would be fine. But what happened when we did that is not that we stopped worshiping. It's just that we started worshiping other things without knowing it. And now you can see this in the public square. We worship politics, we worship science. I mean, even when those things can be good sometimes, when you hear people talk about trust the science, right? Dr. Fauci represents the science.
He is.
Or yes, he is the science, right? And of course, you know better than anybody. That's not somebody doing science. That's a claim to occult knowledge, to secret clerical wisdom that empowers him to tell us what to do. And in politics, you see people bend the knee at BLM rallies and they beg for absolution. They ask for forgiveness. These are religious behaviors. They're kind of rituals that show where our hearts are headed. And so what I say in the book about this is, it's very delicate when you start talking about religion. People say, oh, you're shoving your beliefs down my throat, or you're trying to evangelize me, and all these things. And we have freedom of religion in this country. I believe in it firmly. But what I think we really need is to just to realize a little bit that we're already worshiping. It's less of a conversion and more of a realization. That's the first step. And once you know that, once you understand that about yourself, then you can ask, well, what is worthy of my worship? What deserves to be in that highest good spot? And, the spoiler alert is that the answer is not Dr. Fauci. It's not the World Economic Forum. It's not the CDC, because those are entities that are going to betray you. They're going to disappoint you, even if they do good things sometimes. Ultimately, they're going to fail you. And so the tradition is where we go. The scriptures are where we go to ask, what is worthy of worship? What can I worship that will set me free rather than put me in chains? And there's only one answer to that question, and it's God.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting that a lot of the scientists they don't look at what they say, because they say all of a sudden there was this big bang and everything became perfectly organized. Now, these are the same people who believe in the second law of thermodynamics, entropy, which says things move toward a state of disorganization. So all of a sudden, everything is perfect, and our solar system, the way the planets orbit, the sun, the way they rotate on their axis, they're just the right distance from the sun so that they don't burn up or free. Right. I mean, it's pretty awesome and amazing that anybody can believe that just happened.
And by the way, the point, the dimensionless point from which it all expands is outside of time and space, right? It exists in a region where those categories don't obtain. And you think, well, that's just if you believe that everything naturally tends toward chaos, and yet from a timeless, spaceless, dimensionless point, there suddenly bloomed time, space, and order, and constants, gravitational and constants and strong force constants that exist within a tiny range of possible values for them to support conscious life, then the question is, why would you look at that universe and assume that there is no God? Or why would you invent all sorts of reasons? Well, there's a multiverse, for instance, that explains why there is no God. And you think, well, only if you were living according to a faith, right? Only if you had a certain conviction before you came to the question, that certain answers had to be predetermined. And I think that's basically what atheism has become in science. It has become a dogma that is not to be questioned. It was never a discovery of science. Science never discovered or proved atheism because it wasn't designed to look at that set of questions.
Now, they become their own gods in a way.
Yes.
Proclaiming themselves wise, they became fools, as it says in Romans 1. And that is a clear manifestation. And if you proclaim yourself to be God, then things like transgenderism become a whole lot easier, because there is no God who actually knows why this is a male and a female. So I get to decide. And
right,
and of course, does it lead to anything good? Does it clarify anything, or does it lead to massive confusion?
Right. I mean, this is why the question of reality and the question of God are really the same question, because absolute truth is the question of God. It must be his mind and his judgment that sets that limit of what is real, what is male and female, or else there is no limit, and as you say, you can just kind of reconfigure. But that same Romans passage, right? Not only do they try to become gods, they also worship, images of animals and
Right.
beasts and these, things in the material world, which was a very widespread practice, not just in Greece and Rome, as Paul is talking about, but certainly in Mesopotamia and Babylon, you can still dig up sculptures of gods with various bestial heads and so forth. And this is sort of what we do. If we don't have something outside the world to worship, we have to pick something
Right.
inside the world to worship. And
Exactly.
yeah.
Well, you're obviously a significant historian. You've looked at a lot of writings from a lot of different eras. Uh, why why is rewriting American history such a dangerous path to take?
Well, what's really important, I think, about that question, and it's a great one, is that it goes back to our conversation earlier about art, that we don't just make arguments with ideas and with reason, although those are very important, but we also make them through narrative and storytelling. And there are certain truths in history that are so big and so important that even the kind of myths that grow up around them have a certain truth. Things like, Washington chopping down the cherry trees and I cannot tell a lie, right? These ideas that this guy was that virtuous from the beginning, that story tells you something about our founders, that they were men of extraordinary virtue. And if you then follow that idea into its historical fact, you will learn how true it really is, that Washington, forewent a crown, that he wouldn't become king, that he led an army in a revolution, as many people have done, including Julius Caesar, and yet, never became king, but installed these ideals in our nation. These things are unutterably precious. They're inestimably valuable, and they don't just drop out of the sky. They have a history. They come from somewhere. And so, when somebody like Nicole Hannah-Jones of the 1619 Project or BLM or, these various other factions that are trying to rewrite our history, when they tell these other stories, like that America was founded on slavery, that we fought the revolution to preserve slavery against Britain, which is totally false, they know it's false, a lot of these things. They often know it's false, but they keep saying it over and over again because they're trying to create an artistic picture. They're trying to tell us about who we are. And that kind of project, that effort is a classic totalitarian impulse and authoritarian impulse. I mean, you look at the Soviet Union, this is something that was frequently done, the rewriting of history to convey certain political, ideological messages. Athens, at its breakdown, when it fell, began to do something similar. So they know exactly what they're up to, and it's not just a matter of historical interest. It's actually an urgent matter for the present that we tell the right
Absolutely.
stories.
And of course, your history is the basis of your identity. Your identity is the basis of your beliefs. And if you destroy that chain, then you become like a leaf blowing in the wind, very easy to manipulate, which is, I think, the reason when ISIS goes in and conquers an area, they destroy the history.
Right.
And we're doing it voluntarily. And it's so important, I think, that people recognize we don't have a perfect history. There's no place that is inhabited by human beings that has a perfect history. That's why we need a savior. But the fact of the matter is, we have a strong history in this country. And if you look at the whole thing, the good, the bad, and the ugly, you see there's a lot more good than there is bad and ugly. And to try to build our future on the bad things, obviously that has an incredibly deleterious effect on the perceptions of those young people who are being indoctrinated. And one of the reasons I think we have to fight so hard to make sure that people are educated properly, given the real information. Go back and study what has happened in the past. You look at some of the things that are happening right now in today's world with Putin trying to reestablish, the Soviet Union, starting with Ukraine. And then look at how Hitler started. If you don't understand the things that have happened in the past, and then you don't recognize them as they're happening now. And you're not able to learn from those things and take corrective action in time to avoid a disaster.
Well, that's very beautifully put, and there's something I would add to that as well, which is, when we condemn our history, as you say, it's not just that we're wrong because our relative to the possibilities in the world, it's a very broken, fallen world, no doubt, and there are many terrible things in our history and in every history. But as you say, we have a good and a great history as things go. And also, when we condemn our history, we are using ideals that came to us from our ancestors. So if you say it's an atrocity that Americans held slaves, well, that's perfectly true. It is an atrocity. But the next question is, why do you know it's an atrocity? Why do you believe that that was wrong? And the answer is, well, because all men are created equal and they're endowed by their creator with the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And, that idea didn't fall out of the sky. In fact, if you study most of history, you'll learn that most people in most times and most places have not believed that all men are created equal. These are very, very precious ideas that had to be grasped really through years of study and debate. And when our founders put them into words, they were drawing themselves on Athenian political philosophy, Roman ideas, but also, of course, Scripture, the Creator who endows us with these rights because we're in His image. And so the notion that we would throw that out because it wasn't perfect, well, it's like no ideal drops perfectly into the sky. We always progress toward it. And yeah, the people that came up with these ideas didn't immediately embody them. But guess what? I don't perfectly embody them and live up to them either. And the folks that are asking us to scrap it all also definitely don't live up to these ideals. So it's like, what are you going to replace it with?
Right. And if they look back at our history and our history of our founders, they'll see that there was some significant controversy amongst them about slavery. But also, you might come to recognize, if you're a historian, that virtually every society has had to grapple with slavery, with that issue.
Right.
And so that did not make us unique because we had slavery. They want you to think that we're uniquely evil. What is unique is that we were the only society that had so many people who were vehemently opposed to it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a lot of our population to get rid of it.
Right.
And, those are the kinds of issues that should be discussed. When we talk about slavery and things like reparations, recognize that the majority of white people in the South did not own slaves. That was something for aristocrats. You had to be rich for that. So, to sort of smear everybody just doesn't make any sense. And how does it ever lead to anything that's good? And that's what we have to start thinking. And I think that's where leadership comes in. A good leader or a bad leader can have profound effect on the direction of a nation.
Yes, this is a very important point, and the concept that comes to mind from classical philosophy is the concept of statesmanship, that what we look for when we look for a leader is not just a calculator, not just somebody who can run the numbers and tell us what the perfect way of organizing society is, but he has the virtue, in Greek it's called phronesis, which is like practical wisdom. It's about taking these big ideas that you and I are talking about here and asking, well, what can we do in this here and now moment, given where we are? I mean, another person who comes to mind as when you talk about how a leader can turn things around in this sort of more positive direction is you think about the first term of Mayor Giuliani in the 90s in New York. That this was a flawed individual, as we all are. This was somebody that, I don't agree with him about everything. I doubt he agrees with me about everything if he knew who I was. And yet, this is a person that exhibited that that virtue of phronesis, of practical wisdom, that he took a series of problems. He had also a series of ideas about how human beings ought to be able to live, in freedom from violence and crime. And he put those into practice in this very concrete way. And as you say, New York has been living off of that for a long time. They're starting to lose that again, but that it's remarkable how quickly it can change if a leader takes the reins.
It is amazing. We have fascinating guest, Spencer Klavan, and we're going to be right back in a minute. Stay with us. And we're back with more common sense. Spencer Klavan is with us. And I want to ask you, what is your impression of what's been going on recently at places like Asbury College, where they were having this major revival? The students, there's only about 2,000 people on the campus, but they had 50 to 70,000 people coming in and participating in the revival. Wow. What do you think these young people are seeing that's happening in our country?
Well, I think the first thing is hunger, longing, yearning. I think that the culture is really doing a disservice to young people, even people, younger than I am. I'm 32, and sort of thought until recently that I sort of counted as among the youngest generation. But there's now a whole generation of people that are definitely younger than me and lived through a different experience than I did. I was able still to enjoy the fruits of kind of American greatness in the 90s, as I recall, as I remember it. And a lot of these kids, when I talk to them, it doesn't matter if they think of themselves as conservative or liberal, but they don't have a recollection of America as a healthy society. They don't regard America as a healthy civilization. That's very hard for somebody like me to hear, I think, but it is true. It is a way that people are experiencing this country. And so they feel the emptiness of what our culture has to offer them in a way that even I, who am a big critic of our culture, even I still don't really feel that emptiness in the direct way that they do. And there is I have to say, some hopefulness for me in this. I don't want anybody to have to live through that kind of experience. But I do think, G.K. Chesterton, the great Christian apologian, said that if you want to receive the good news, you have to get the bad news first. And that idea that, like, the world of man, the offerings of man cannot satisfy, and that if we try to become as gods and we try to get our meaning and our satisfaction out of our technology or our prosperity or our material goods, ultimately all of those gods will break our hearts and betray us. And so when I see, this what's happening in Kentucky and the way that young people are clamoring for meaning, I mean, we began this conversation on the occasion of this book that I just wrote, and it's because I had the sense of that hunger that I wrote it. I've been speaking about these issues for some years now. And when I started out, I think it was easy for me to think, well, ancient philosophy, classical ideas, these are kind of niche interests, and so it'll be fine for me to just talk about them in my little circle. But I met so quickly with so much hunger for sensible, sane ideas about the big questions. Right. And those big questions need answers. We can't get by without answers to those questions. And we think that we can, but ultimately they come due. So I think that's really what I see when I see people. I can't predict the future, whether this is going to grow into a blaze and a nationwide movement. I sure hope so, and I sure think there's the possibility there. But really, if we were wanting to encourage that, what we have to acknowledge is this is a response to real cultural emptiness, real need.
Well, the United States of America has been the shiny city on the hill for so many. And even today, with all the negativity and people talking about how horrible we are, systemically racist and all, you still see people clamoring to get in here. If it was so bad, why would they all be trying to get in here? Think about it. Right. But, Benjamin Franklin in 1787, after the end of the Constitutional Convention came out, and he was asked, "Sir, what do we have here? A monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "A republic if you can keep it. If you can keep it." Was he talking basically about the same thing you're talking about and saving?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, something else that comes to mind when you say this is when Abraham Lincoln said, "We must either nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope of earth." And I'm quoting from memory there, so I may have gotten some words, but that was the idea.
Right.
And the reason that America matters when you talk about saving the West is because even as we're in this terrible, I think, really rough time for our country and its leadership, we are still, I think, the best idea politically that the West has ever produced. As you said, with that Franklin quote, we are a republic. And that is a very delicate kind of political organization based around the idea that mankind should be free. It comes from, as I talk about in the regime section of the book, it comes from this long history of thinking about the different ways to build a civilization. You have basically three ways of ruling over one another. You could have a monarchy where one person rules, an oligarchy where a few people rule, or an aristocracy if they're the best people, and then the rule by the many, which we would now call democracy. And each of these forms of government can be done well, or it can decay. But because humanity is the way it is, they often do decay. So a monarchy can decay into a tyranny, right? The person will just take control for his own good. And then if you have an uprising that leads then, the aristocracy takes control, then that can decay into an oligarchy or into cronyism. And if the people take control, even the people aren't perfect. Lincoln knew this best of all, maybe, that the people can become a mob. And so a republic is like a little perpetual motion machine that's designed to take all of these different forms of rule, all these different kinds of power, and balance them against one another. That's why we have checks and balances. That's why we have a tripartite constitution. All of these things are there. Nothing is there without thought. Everything was very carefully placed there. And one thing that John Adams said we need, if we want to keep that machine going, the kind of fuel that keeps it working, is a moral and religious people. Yeah. People can't maintain that civilization unless they have those bonds of what the Greeks would call philia, friendship or civic love that bind them together. And that, I think, is, when we start to talk about these revivals that we're seeing, this hunger that people have for meaning, I think it's because we sense that we're doomed without that. The machine can't run unless we are the kind of the glue that holds it together, and that means morality and religion.
Exactly. Well, I'll tell you, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
And can you tell people where they can get your book and hear more about your work?
Thank you. Yes, I'd be delighted. I am on Twitter at Spencer Klavan, but the book is available anywhere, and I would encourage people, if you like listening to things, it's on Audible, and I did do the audiobook myself, so you can listen to me read it, or you can get it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, really anywhere that books are sold, and it's a way to get a kind of inroad into the stuff that you and I have been talking about, the wisdom of the past.
Well, I have to tell you, it's an incredible encouragement to people of my generation to know that there are young people of your generation who are actually thinking about these things.
Thank you.
And who actually believe that there is a moral basis for our existence. Mm. And I think it gives me hope. When I see the things that are going on at some of the colleges, I see young people like yourself. I see parents rising up and demanding that the right things be taught in the schools. Mm-hmm. I would say to those people who are getting really discouraged and ready to throw in the towel, don't throw the towel in, because there has been turmoil like this ever since there's been mankind. And we just have to be persistent in recognizing that this too will pass. So thank you so much for being with us today. Keep
Thank
up
you,
the
Dr.
wonderful
Carson.
work, and we'll be following what you're doing.
Thank you. It's been an honor. It's really lovely to talk to you. Thanks.
Thank you. And we'll be right back with my closing comments and your prescription for this week. Well, I hope you enjoyed that fascinating talk with Spencer Klavan. You know, he's 32 years old. He's young. He represents another generation. That means there's hope for us. There are others like him. There are all those young people, at the colleges who are starting to recognize that we're not each other's enemies and that we don't have to hurt other people. We don't have to cancel other people. We can work together. We can have different beliefs, but we can still work together. That's what community is all about. And I want you, for your prescription for this week, to continue the fight. Remember the fundamentals of who we are as a nation. Be willing to discuss that with other people. And finally, remember the cornerstone principles: faith, liberty, community, and life. And make sure you go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure you don't miss any episodes. Tell your friends and families. And let's bring common sense back to America. See you next week.